Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States led by John F. Kennedy and the Soviet Union led by Nikita Khrushchev during the Cold War, and was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. After the conclusion of World War II, communism rapidly spread across the globe. In 1959, Fidel Castro rose to power and took control of Cuba. The United States now felt threatened, having a communist government so close they began looking at invading Cuba. After the failed USA attempt to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any future invasion attempt. Construction of several missile sites began in the late summer, but intelligence discovered evidence of a general Soviet arms buildup on Cuba during routine surveillance flights. On September 4, 1962, President Kennedy issued a public warning against the introduction of offensive weapons into Cuba. Despite the warning, on October 14 the USA aircraft took several pictures clearly showing sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles under construction in Cuba. These images were processed and presented to the White House the next day, thus precipitating the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy summoned his closest advisors to consider options and direct a course of action for the United States that would resolve the crisis. Some advisors, including all the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for an airstrike to destroy the missiles, followed by an invasion of Cuba. Others favored stern warnings to Cuba and the Soviet Union. The president decided upon a middle course. On October 22, he ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. That same day, Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev declaring that the United States would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and demanded that the Soviets dismantle the missile bases already under construction or completed, and return all offensive weapons to the USSR. The letter was the first in a series of direct and indirect communications between the White House and the Kremlin throughout the remainder of the crisis. Arguably, the most dangerous moment in the crisis was not recognized until the Cuban Missile Crisis Havana Conference, in October 2002. Attended by many of the veterans of the crisis, they all learned that on October 27, 1962, USS Beale had tracked and dropped signaling depth charges on B-59, a Soviet Project 641 submarine. Unknown to the US, it was armed with a 15-kiloton nuclear torpedo. Running out of air, the Soviet submarine was surrounded by American warships and desperately needed to surface. An argument broke out among three officers aboard B-59, including submarine captain Valentin Savitsky, political officer Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov, and deputy brigade commander captain 2nd rank Vasily Arkhipov. An exhausted Savitsky became furious and ordered that the nuclear torpedo on board be made combat-ready. Accounts differ about whether Arkhipov convinced Savitsky not to make the attack or whether Savitsky himself finally concluded that the only reasonable choice left open to him was to come to the surface. During the conference, it was stated that nuclear war had come much closer than people had thought, and a guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. No one was sure how Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would respond to the naval blockade and the United States' demands. But the leaders of both superpowers recognized the devastating possibility of a nuclear war and publicly agreed to a deal in which the Soviets would dismantle the weapons sites in exchange for a pledge from the United States not to invade Cuba. In a separate deal, which remained secret for more than 25 years, the United States also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Although the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, they escalated the building of their military arsenal. The missile crisis was over, the arms race was not. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a singular event during the Cold War and strengthened Kennedy's image domestically and internationally. In an effort to prevent this from happening again, a direct telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin was established. It became known as the Hotline.